I will be discussing Beloved by Toni Morrison, and my lens is ethnic lens. I will mention how slavery has played a part in this and how the different races have an influence on the viewpoints of what is happening throughout the book. Some background information is that the book takes place in Kentucky around the 1850s. So my theme statement is, in the novel Beloved, Toni Morrison illustrates how slavery distanced the slave owners and the slaves. My first point would be from Paul D and how he sees the school teacher and Miss Garner. Miss Garner is a slave owner and school teacher is his school teacher. The quote states, "He thought what they said had merit and what they felt was serious. Deferring to his slaves' opinions did not deprive him of authority or power. It was schoolteacher who taught them otherwise, a truth that waved like a scarecrow in rye. They were only sweet home men at sweet home." This quote from chapter 13. So basically he mentions how slavery didn't deprive him of authority or power. It like kind of gave him the power instead of like taking it away. It kind of made him stronger. Since he is intelligent, and he is described as very human compared to everyone else, even though he was black and a slave during the time. This kind of relates to my theme because I mentioned how there was this distance between slave owners and the slaves, since they both have different opinions. Another quote is from chapter 15. It's basically describing how trauma can have an influence on why whites and blacks are very distant from each other, or why the slave owners and the slaves are very distant from each other. So the quote basically mentions, "Loaves and fishes were his power. They did not belong to an ex-slave who had probably never carried 100 pounds to the scale or picked okra with a baby on her back, who had never been lashed by a 10-year-old white boy, as God knows they had, who had not even escaped slavery. The white brother and sister who gave stamp paid Ella and John clothes, goods, and gear for runaways because they hated slavery worse than they hated slaves." So this kind of shows how different the blacks and the whites were, because it's describing the trauma of what the whites went through and what the blacks went through. Since everybody at the time had different experiences with trauma, whether that's physical or psychological, it kind of gives this hard and distance between the two races, since they can't really bond with each other if there's this past over them and an open wound that they need to heal first before coming as a community and really bonding together. This relates to my theme because, they're describing the distance and how trauma can really have an influence on everything that's happening, and how if they don't get past that, then they can't really connect with each other, even though, since their traumas are so different from each other. A third quote that I found is from chapter 15 also. So here they're basically discussing, this is a quote from Baby Suggs, and how she's describing how the Garners, who I mentioned before are slave owners, how they treated the people, more specifically the slaves. The quote, "Slaves, the gardeners, it seemed to her, ran a special kind of slavery, treating them like paid labor, listening to what they said, teaching what they wanted to know, and he didn't stud his boys. Never brought them to her cabin with directions to lay down with her like they did in Carolina. or rented their sex out of other farms. It surprised her and pleased her, but worried her too. Would he pick women for them, or did he think was going to happen when those boys ran smack into their natures? Some danger he was courting, and he surely knew it. In fact, his order for them not to leave Sweet Home except his company was not so much because of the law, but the danger of men bred slaves on the loose. Um, so Baby Suggs is basically describing how she thinks that the man bred slaves who don't go to bed without any women will be prone to becoming rapists or raping women. Um, so this is kind of the point in the book where Baby Suggs kind of introduces a stereotype of black men and how they could be seen as sexual animals, kind of like proning them to prey on innocent or frail white women into raping them. And so this relates to my theme because it's kind of, since there's this stereotype coming upon uh, how black men can be seen as sexual animals, and like raping the slave owners might have some trust issues with the slaves and kind of distance them, since there's this like stereotype, if they don't get women, they'll get then they'll rape your women. um, so in conclusion, slave owners and slaves have a hard time to connect since slavery makes it hard for them to connect. And so this relates to ethnic lens because we're talking about race here, since they are very different and they grew up in very different environments. Um, Whether, that's through slavery or through trauma or through things brought up that can create this image for other people, and basically the everyday struggles of slavery throughout the book through different standpoints that can really influence why slave owners and slavery can't really have this connection and kind of have this distance from each other.